that is licensed by the Green Burial Council out of about 1,400 or so funeral homes in Ohio. So we're pretty knowledgeable in this aspect, but we're by far not the end all be all. So if you hear something in my talk today and you have a question or something, say, you know, I've heard this, it's possible in different states or different communities, there's different practices that might still be considered green burial for it. So that gives you kind of an idea of who I am. And I'd like to start off with maybe a little history here. I'm hopeful that my PowerPoint will work here, and I believe it will. The lawn cemetery. Good, good. So they're somewhat of a recent innovation here in the scheme of things. They're Victorian era, and they were really sent around as activities and places for the living. You know, back then people would go, they'd have picnic at their church and their church graveyard, and they'd go and visit their ancestors there. And they use a lot of fertilizers, a lot of pesticides, a lot of herbicides, and they use what are called concrete vaults for lawn maintenance, which I'm going to touch on in a little bit. And a lot of the cemeteries are starting to get closer to capacity. They probably might not reach in my lifetime, but probably definitely some of the ones around here in my daughter's lifetimes. They're going to start to fill up, and they're going to have to figure out another way on what we're going to do here with all these huge tracts of land with people buried in concrete vaults in them. So there's some environmental impact I wanted to go over here. Each year, there's about 22,500 cemeteries in the U.S. We bury, 4.3 million gallons of embalming fluid and formaldehyde, 20 million board feet of hardwoods, 1.6 million tons of concrete, 17,000 tons of copper and bronze, and about 64,000 tons of steel. And to put that into perspective, that is enough steel and concrete and wood to build a 2-lane highway from Detroit to New York City every single year there. So if you think about that, the amount of materials that are going underground and are staying underground, it's mind-boggling there. The other option is often considered as cremation. And, what's the environmental impact of cremation? Uses fossil fuels to maintain. We have to get our retort up to about 1900 degrees, which uses a lot of gas, uses a lot of energy to do that. And you've got to maintain that for about 2+ hours. That's a very loose figure there. That really depends on the person that is in the retort and what they're encased in as well. You see this one, they're using a casket. Most of the time we don't use a casket. We'll use a cardboard structure, which is required by law for that. But it still takes a tremendous amount of energy when we do cremate someone. Additionally, if you're like me, I always had a sweet tooth when I was a kid, and I have these old fillings, this dental amalgam into my teeth here. If I were to be cremated, it's just going to release all of that stuff up into the air, into the atmosphere. And Britain estimates it accounts for about 16% of emissions. I've not seen a figure here in the States on that, but I do know that it does produce around 250 pounds of CO2 per cremation, which if you think about what 250 pounds is, that's all in total. It's a lot. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of byproducts as well, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulates, all of those things are totally sent up into the atmosphere. It's gotten a little bit better over time. We now have really some, reburners or afterburners that help, but it's still by no means, I would not describe cremation as environmentally conscious. So that leads us to our third option here, which is green burial there. And it's a way of caring for the dead that furthers some environmental aims. And we call it green burial nowadays, but really it's just plain burial. Prior to the Civil War, embalming wasn't really practiced that much, and vaults were almost never used. And it was with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln that brought embalming to the notoriety that it is almost today. When Lincoln was assassinated, they actually sent him via train car back to Springfield to be buried. But they stopped in all these towns along the way, including Cleveland, Ohio, where people came out and they paid their respects to President Lincoln's funeral cortege there. And he was embalmed, and that really sparked the movement. The addition was when these soldiers were sent off in the Civil War and they were dying in battlefields very remote from where they were. You know, it wasn't that travel wasn't common like it is today. You didn't just pick up and hop a horse and buggy to go visit San Francisco or something. These folks were dying far away, and they were either buried right there in the battlefield, or if they had the means, they were embalmed at the actual battlefield, and then they were sent back home for it. And that also sparked an interest in embalming. Now, green burial in its purest form, it obviously conserves natural resources, it reduces carbon, it contributes to the preservation of the habitat, it eliminates, you know, toxic chemicals in vaults and different metal caskets, exotic wood caskets. And by eliminating these toxic chemicals and caskets, you can go to the grave without contributing to non-renewable energy expenditures. And you can really do some environmentally sound practices there. I'm going to talk a little bit about some options, but one of the ones you see in the picture on the screen, that person is wrapped in a burial shroud there. That's a natural fiber. It's got some handles on there. You can't really see those. And then it's got a reusable board beneath it that will actually be pulled out. And you see those ropes there. We'll have the 6 pallbearers, often from the family. They'll actually lower the person into the grave using those ropes that you see there. And then we'll actually place the soil back on top of them. It's very different from the use of a concrete vault and a backhoe to actually dig the grave there. And some green cemeteries here. They're returning to the earth organically. They don't try to inhibit decomposition. They actually try to encourage it. And they run their cemeteries in a responsible and sensitive way for the environment. And they offer community activities for folks to come out and participate and have a final place of remembrance. There are a lot of folks that will do cremation. They may actually take the cremated remains back home with them, and they might stick around in someone's house for a year, 5 years, 10 years, until the person dies maybe, and then they're just left there and no one knows whose urn this is. Is this Aunt Millie's urn or something? And no permanent place to remember there. When we do use a cemetery, you know, even a green cemetery, there's an actual place to go to where you can actually sit and think about the person that was there and lived there, even though their body may not be there anymore. Some different types of cemeteries. There are some that are regular cemeteries with a natural burial ground, some that are hybrid, some that are actually land or conservation trusts, or even recreational preserves there. And there's some science behind this. The folks have actually looked into this to see what happens when someone is buried without a casket and a vault. And they're usually buried down about 3 to 4 feet. It provides for an optimal, you know, moisture and temperature and level for microbes to actually get in and begin the decomposition process. It also means that we can use the land that would otherwise be unusable for it. You might not be able to bury someone in a concrete vault down 3 feet, but you can, and you hit a water table or something, but you can certainly do that with a green burial. Use a lot less land because you're not going down 6, 7, 8 feet, 10 feet sometimes with some of the cemeteries there. We use the soil. It's a natural filter, creates an environment that binds toxins that accumulate in the body over the course of our lives and filters them away. We've not had any problems with the water table or anything like that. Most of that water is about 75 feet below ground. So by the time it gets down there, it's been totally filtered through the soil there. And I'm often asked, what about animals? You know, is an animal going to come down and dig someone up? We've seen no instances of that at all. You know, I don't know, humans just aren't that delicious to them or what, but there's no knowledge that I have of any animals digging up any of the green burial grounds. Really, if you think about it, digging down 3 feet is a lot of effort for, you know, even like a warthog or something. They're probably just going to go and catch something, prey that's living that they can take care of. So that really has not been an issue at all. I talk about some misconceptions. First one is embalming. Most of the time, folks think it's legally required. It is not legally required in Ohio, and it's not legally required in most states in the United States. It's a cosmetic procedure. It does preserve the body, but it does not preserve the body indefinitely by any means. So eventually, even an embalmed body will decay at some point. If we do not embalm a body, what typically happens is the temperature will drop about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit every hour. Calcium will build up in the person's muscles. They'll start to tense up. The cells will break down, and the bacteria in the gut will actually multiply. And in about 72 hours, some microorganisms will begin the putrefaction process within the body, which will eventually allow for oxygen to come in and begin an active decay. The body will then release about 12 gallons of moisture on average, and in about 25 days, the body will weigh only about 40% of what it did at the time of burial there. So anywhere from 6 weeks to 2 years, depending on the person, the soil, the time of year, the environment that they're in, the soft tissue will begin to disintegrate. And then after about 20 years or so, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, the bones will actually totally dissipate. Another misconception is about burial vaults. They're not legally required in Ohio. A lot of cemeteries require them, and the real reason for that is back in the 1800s or so, you'd have 6 cemetery sections hand digging these graves. They just go out there with a shovel and a pickaxe and they take care of it. Put the person in, refill the grave. Nowadays, we have these huge backhoes that come over that actually dig the graves. It's a great time saver, but they found out that when these backhoes went over old graves, they were just crushing the caskets and the person below them. And they were creating these huge depressions in the cemetery where the backhoes went, and people were tripping and falling in them. So the cemetery said, we can't have this. If we're going to use backhoes, we've got to figure something out here. So what they decided to do was they started to require these outer barrel containers, or these vaults. These are these concrete or metal structures. And the main purpose of them is not essentially to protect the body, but rather to keep the cemetery looking nice above ground and prevent tripping hazards for folks. In terms of safety, you know, there's been no infectious agents that would be really of concern on an individual. They're going to greatly diminish at the time of death. And there's little evidence, as I touched on, of groundwater and microorganisms coming into the groundwater after decay. It's not pathogenic The bottom line is there's really marginal risk to the population with green burial at all. There are a few exceptions I always try to note here. If someone has, streptococcus, Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, meningitis, Ebola, something of that nature, there are some precautions. And I'm often asked, what about COVID with that? We've not seen any passing on of COVID from deceased human bodies to any of the funeral directors. The jury's not totally out. They've been studying that a little bit, but everyone that I've talked to, and I've not seen anything that says that COVID is transmitted from a deceased person to even an embalmer who's actually going to be cutting into the tissue or anything like that. So we haven't seen anything of that nature as of yet. Why choose green burial? By and large, people are looking for a sense of place. Like I said, think about their loved one in a familiar setting, and it's in accord with certain religious doctrines. If you are at all familiar with the Jewish or the Muslim faith, they practice green burial almost exclusively. They're in the Orthodox Jewish faith and most of the Muslim faith. They'll use a shroud or they'll use an all-wooden casket for it that's of natural fiber that will just simply degrade into the ground. They don't use vaults. They don't use any embalming or anything of that nature. So for them, green burial is simply just burial. That's all it is there. And a lot of people are now beginning to consider the environmental impact of their exit plan, and they want it to align with their core values in life. They've lived, environmentally sustainable lives as best they can, and they want to carry that into their passing as well. There's a lot of interest in green burial. Most of our green burials are folks that are planning for themselves nowadays, we see. We don't see a lot of the older folks, really, those that are in their 80s or 90s. They just don't have that interest in it as much as the younger folks. A lot of the younger folks that will come in and will pre-plan their funerals, and younger for what I'm talking about is those that are 60s, even some in their 70s is younger in our profession there. And they're the ones that are driving the green burial movement. There are two main groups, baby boomers and spiritual communities. They're leading the way in a demand for an environmentally conscious death practice there. And with its rituals, burial and green burial in particular appeals to people of responsible and reasonable caretaking and stewards, and allows them to acknowledge the loss of their family to the community there. It really is a return to a ritual, per se, that involves environmental stewardship. It involves some economics. There's some economic benefits to green burial. It's often much less expensive than a full traditional burial because you're not purchasing an expensive casket, or an outer burial container or a vault or anything of that nature. So you're really getting to participate. And there's a picture. You can see the folks. I spoke earlier about the folks lowering the person into the grave. That's actually done by the family. You can see some of the family members are helping out there to actually participate. They aren't using a backhoe or anything, and it's really a return to ritual that's central to the human spirit. We celebrate when babies are born, graduations, birthdays. The end of life is no different. Every culture on the planet has a ritual of some sort, typically to mark the end of their life. And so they will continue to do this. And green burial is not an exception, but rather a return to the normal way that it was done prior to the advent of the modern funeral. I get a lot of questions about the timing for green burial on this. So what we typically see when someone passes away, The family may go to the bedside or go to the hospital if they weren't there, or the hospice facility, or if they're at home, they may wait for someone to come by and say hello to the person that is grieving, and then to pay their respects to the deceased person there. And then they'll call us. We will come out. It usually takes us about an hour, depending on where they are in Northeast Ohio. We'll take them into our care. We'll place them into our refrigeration facility. We'll keep the body cool, oftentimes for a day, depending on when the person passed away. If they passed away in the middle of the night or something, we'll meet with the family the following morning. We'll talk about the arrangements. We'll set the dates and times. It's usually pretty quickly. If someone passes on a Monday, we're usually doing a green burial on a Wednesday, maybe a Thursday there. We don't drag it out much longer than that. And we'll have the folks meet us. We'll still go in procession to the cemetery, most likely, or we'll meet at the actual cemetery if it's a distance away. And then we'll perform the burial that afternoon, then, that Wednesday afternoon, if the person passed on a Monday. The family will be present. They may have a religious person present, a minister or a rabbi or someone of that nature, to say some words. It's a simple burial. And then the whole process for burial usually takes about 45 minutes or so from start to finish, not counting the total tamping down of the grave and such with the actual cemetery sextons there. And then they may have a celebration of life a month or two after the fact there for folks that weren't able to make it on that specific day there. I'll conclude here with different types of burial cemeteries. There's hybrid burial grounds. These are conventional cemeteries that offer some form of green burial. There's natural burial grounds, and those are green cemeteries. They prohibit chemicals, non-organic caskets, vaults, non-native markers. And then there are conservation burial grounds. These are on easements, land trusts, that provide a further revenue stream for the conservation there of the cemetery. There are three main cemeteries in Northeast Ohio that I often talk about for green burial. The first one is Riverside Cemetery. That's on Pearl Road. It's kind of by Metro Hospital there. They are a traditional hybrid cemetery. They have traditional grave sites, but they also have a natural burial section. They will not allow you to be buried in a shroud there, but they will allow for a biodegradable casket to be used. And they don't require a vault in that section at all. The other one is All Souls Cemetery out in Chardon. That's a Catholic cemetery. Green burial is very in line with the Catholic faith. It's again the same thing. They'll allow for burial, no vault required there, and you can go in any one of the natural burial graves. Again, it is a hybrid cemetery. They have regular burial grounds, the traditional burial grounds, and then they have a natural section. And the other one I always like to mention is Foxfield Preserve. And they're down in Wilmont, Ohio. They're about an hour or so's drive, maybe a little more, depending on where you are in Cleveland. They're south of Canton. And they're actually on a nature preserve there. So you go down this little road, and then you just come out, and all of a sudden you're just in a nature preserve there. And they've set aside part of the nature preserve for green burials there. And they're really a true green burial cemetery there. You can go there, you can use a burial shroud, you can bury the person, you don't use a gravestone, they can mark it with GPS. If you want to have a little stone, a natural stone, you can do that. You can plant a native species on the grave to mark it, a native tree. You have to clear it with the preserve, of course, on that. They'll let you know what you can and can't plant, but you can do that as a marker, and you have a place there to always remember your loved one there. So it is a distance away, but I've never had anyone that has gone there say anything but wonderful things about it. if you're looking for a day's drive or something to do, I highly recommend going there, walking the grounds, and looking around and seeing what's available to you if you're at all inclined on green burial. That's the quick summation of my talk here, but I always make myself available to answer questions after. So if there are any questions, anything about green burial or anything else, I'm available. And if you don't feel like asking a question now, you can always email me. My email is simply just my name, chadmcgreevey@gmail.com. So with further ado, I'll turn it over to Patrick. And if there are any questions, feel free, let me know.
Thank you very much, Chad. That was extremely informative, and I definitely learned a lot. And I was taking notes, thinking like, "Oh, I've got to put more stuff into my own, will that I didn't even think about." But are there any questions that anybody has? So I've got a question, Chad. You mentioned some hybrid options closer, like Riverside Cemetery on Pearl, and then All Souls Cemetery. Yes. Neither of those allow the shroud. Is that correct?
Riverside does not allow a shroud. You could in theory use a burial shroud, but you still have to be in a casket. And that has to do with the way that they do green burial. The way that they actually place the casket into the ground. They need something rigid. I've talked to them because one of our shrouds does have an ability to have a piece of wood inserted into the bottom of it, so it's a rigid container. But they aren't willing to accept that as of yet. What we most commonly use when we do one at Riverside, we use a bamboo woven casket. It's a hand woven casket. It looks just like a basket. It's like a big basket there, and it's naturally sustainable bamboo. And there's some rope, some like hemp or jute rope that binds it together, and a bamboo base to it. And they've accepted that no problem there, and that's been very well received by folks.
So Carrie has a question, and she asked it through the meeting chat, and her question is, how does a green cemetery save land use?
Sure. So the green cemetery, like I mentioned, these graves are going to, essentially the person is going to disintegrate over time, over 20 years. You could, in theory, reuse that land if you wanted to. I don't know of any cemetery that is actually doing that. A lot of them will say, you have this deed in perpetuity, but they will allow that. The other option is the actual nature preserve there. There's no concrete markers. You wouldn't know you were in a cemetery at all. Once they fill up one section, it's a meadow there.
And that's Foxfield. Foxfield Preserve is the closest one to us.
Yeah, there's another one in Galion, Ohio, I believe, and there's some in Cincinnati as well. But I'm most familiar with Foxfield just because it's so close to where we're at.
And that is a 501c3 nonprofit that is a land conservancy. And I believe they have I've not been there. I still need to visit, hopefully before my last visit. And I believe they have a nature center. And then are there actual walking paths around? Like it's kind of like a park?
Yes, it's very, very, you're amongst nature there, but there is a nice nature center. They put on presentations. I assume that they do like field trips and such for kids, local kids, to learn about nature. It's very geared towards that. It's kind of like a museum type of feel for nature in the actual structure that they have there, and it's a good sized structure, but the actual imprint of the facility is huge. The actual preserve there, and there's walking paths, there's bird watching, there's different flowers and guided paths from the folks there. During COVID, they weren't ever shut down, I don't believe, but they were obviously greatly reduced in terms of staff, and I believe they've relaxed some of that as time has gone on now.
Okay. And Carrie has another question.
Sure.
And that is, what's the cost difference between a traditional burial and a green burial?
Sure. So for a traditional burial, I can speak to our averages. It's probably around somewhere between 8 and 10,000 for the full service, the embalming, the visitation, the preparation, the vault, and the casket for that. For a green burial, it's less than half of that. Again, it depends. If you go with the shroud, it's much more economical. It's around 4,000 in total for a visitation. And I should mention you can still have a visitation with green burial. You know, the person is not embalmed per se. There's no formaldehyde or anything, but we can still keep the person cool. You can see the person, pay your respects. It does have to be quicker. We can't do it, 2 weeks after the fact typically.
Of course.
But we can do that. And so you're looking at around 4,000 for all of that with a shroud. If you go with a bamboo casket, then it's a little under 5,000 then for that.
Okay.
So it's a tremendous savings in that regard. And you're still allowed to have all the same rights that you would with a traditional burial. We can still take you into church, we can still have the viewing, we can still have the procession to the cemetery, and still have the burial.
Great. I've got a question. Is there a scent involved with not embalming?
So that's on a case-by-case basis. I won't lie, there can be a scent. Usually it's not anything that's going to repel a person, with the caveat if the person has been passed away a long time before we took them into our care. Then if they've been if someone passed away at their home and no one knew about it, and we didn't get there until 3 days later or something, and they haven't, it's July, there might be an odor at that point. But if someone passes at their home, they're there, we come in, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours later, we take them into our care, we have the visitation a couple days later, there's almost nothing, that you would notice. We'll put, maybe some dry ice with the person to keep them cool during the visitation, and some natural flowers, that give a nice aroma on top of the vessel that they use. And we've had no problems in that regard.
Great to hear. Are there other questions? I've got another question about, you mentioned that, certain religions, green burial is just burial. Because that's the way they've always done it.
Yes.
And I've got friends from around the world, and I've heard of different stories of different burial practices in other countries, like in Nepal, like they bring some bodies up to the mountain and they let the bird eat it.
Vulture burial.
Vulture burial. And then I think maybe it's in Greece where they don't have enough room, or maybe it's just one of the islands in Greece. They don't have enough room for burial, so they only temporarily bury them. And they dig up, the part of the tradition is to go dig up the bones.
That's in the islands of Greece they'll do that, and they'll bury the person for usually 2+ years, and then they'll come and the family will actually retrieve the bones from the actual grave site, and then they'll reuse that because they don't have the space on some of these islands.
So it's almost like they're renting the space for the decomposition of the soft tissues.
Exactly.
And, I think I might have seen that in a Cleveland International Film Festival a short film. But what percentage of burials are natural like that? Do you have a sense of?
I can say almost a really good portion of Jewish and Muslims are natural burials. In terms of ours, we serve a predominantly either non-secular or Christian-based groups here on the west side where we're at. That's our most two traditional ones. I would say really of the burials, maybe 5 to 10% at the most, probably closer to the 5% range as of now.
Right.
But I will say our pre-need trend's much higher than that. And by pre-need, I mean people who come in and they actually set up their funerals ahead of time, ahead of need. They'll come in. It's much higher. It's almost close to 20% of folks show an interest in the green burial at that point. And as the ages skew younger, there's more and more interest to it. A lot of folks, now that, my parents' generation, even if they aren't churched, at a time of crisis when someone dies, they go to something familiar. They'll return to the church. They'll return to a traditional way to do it because that's what they've known. That's what they grew up with. That's what their parents had. Again, the baby boomers are changing. They've changed everything, and they're changing funerals as well for it. And so they're much more receptive to a natural return to the earth.
And how did you get involved in green burials?
That's a good question. So, like I said, I grew up in the funeral industry, and I mean, I've seen people embalmed. For me, I understand the preservation aspect of embalming, or if you're going to go out of the country, you need to be embalmed and stuff. But I just like the natural idea of a return to the earth. For me, it's something that just resonated with me. And so I became interested in that. Like I said, I started in this industry when I could wash a car. So I've been doing it forever. So I've seen all different manner. And that's the one that most resonated with me. That's how I'll be buried. For me, personally, cremation was not an option. One, I don't like fire. and two, I want that natural return to the earth. So that's what I'll have. I have everything laid out. I'm in suits. Literally, I almost sleep in these things for my profession. But I want to be buried in my cotton track suit. I want to have a natural return. I don't want to be embalmed, and I want to just have a place where my kids can go and remember where I'm at. So that's what drove my interest in it.
That makes sense. And if I remember correctly, I think I've read that there's some dangers for your industry working in it, that you have higher percentages of certain cancers because of working with the embalming fluids?
Yes, formaldehyde is a carcinogen. There's no question about that. I am actually not a licensed embalmer. I am actually simply a licensed funeral director. But we do monitoring where we have a badge that we'll wear periodically that will actually test the levels of formaldehyde that we're being exposed to. We have to be under certain limits. We have to have certain ventilation and such for that because it's been proven that we have a higher risk of developing cancer. Most of the embalmers, the funeral directors, a little bit, they are around it, but they aren't in the exposure that someone who's actually performing the procedure is.
So there is that piece on top of it, is to protect other human life that is still alive, of course, and that maybe you don't want to be a part of something that is potentially making someone else sick.
Exactly. Very good question.
Yeah. Any other questions anybody has?
So, at the beginning, you said that you're one of 13 owner operators in Ohio out of 1,300. Is that what you said?
Yeah, roughly 1,300 funeral homes in Ohio.
Okay.
There are about 13 of us, and like us, we have 2 locations. Some have more locations, but roughly 13 owner operators are certified by the Green Burial Council here in Ohio.
And must a funeral home be certified in order to do this?
No, that's a good question. You do not need a certification to do this. We pass some certain requirements that they know that what we're doing. Have you ever heard the term greenwashing at all? Where folks will say it's green, but it's not as green. might bury you, but if you put someone in a solid mahogany casket, that's not really in the nature of what you're trying to do there. Or you tell someone that they have to be embalmed to have a viewing. There's no state law about that. That's simply the operator's purview there that says that they require that. So we went through that with the Green Burial Council, and we were able to achieve that rating that said, yes, these folks are doing environmentally sustainable funerals, and they want to recognize that for it. And we go through a recertification every, I think it's every 2 years now. It was originally every year. I think it might be every 2 years now, or at least I haven't gotten the certification email yet this year. So.
No, I think it's awesome. I really think this has been a wonderful presentation. I just love the idea of not being like a liability to the earth forever because of the way you choose to be buried. I mean, really, that's kind of what's going on. And it just blows my mind that culturally we kind of got to this point where now we have to make these huge changes. So thank you for being a part of doing the right thing.
Like I said, it's like a full circle. This was the way it was done for hundreds of years, you know, and we're just coming back to it now.
Right. Right. Well, thank you. It's awesome.
Thank you.
And Chad, have you buried anybody in a mushroom suit yet?
No, I have not. And to be honest, the jury is still out on the mushroom suit.
Okay.
It's not, people aren't really sure that it's that beneficial or could actually inhibit decay, because if it's not allowing nature to come in through it, then it's not going to help. If you were to, from what I understand, if you were to use the mushroom suit above ground, it might be very beneficial. But if you were to bury someone in it, like you mentioned, Luke Perry used it, they're still not sure that this is actually helping by any means. It's interesting. It gets a lot of people talking in that regard. Right. You know, it's not, oh, I'm going to be feeding mushrooms, but we're not really sure that that's the case.
Well,
I've not buried anyone in it yet.
Yeah, there was a very interesting film that came out, and I think it was at some of the independent theaters 2 years ago about the fungi. And I think it was, I ended up seeing it. I cannot recall the name of it at the moment, but the reality is that underground there's these massive networks of fungi already operating, and that's what's really doing the decomposition or working in conjunction with or other organisms. So yeah, it's a lot of molds and non-mushroom fungi that can tolerate the high pH and the ammonia levels there. And as the ammonia degrades, it becomes very acidic down there. So it's kind of changing. You know, we're not sure that a mushroom would be the best use of that. It might actually inhibit. But that's the decomposition of the body.
The decomposition. Yes, exactly. So, but it's possible. I mean, there are some, like I said, there are some fungi, and especially later in the process, they do have a relationship with the breakdown, but it's not right at the beginning, and that's where the thought is perhaps this is actually inhibiting the early stages. If you could, in theory, maybe bring someone back up, put them in a mushroom suit, you know, 4 months after and put them back down, that might be a different story, but that's not feasible.
Right. Because you'd mentioned the toxins that could be in fillings that would be released if you were to cremate a body. But then it's my understanding from a toxicology course that I took in college that the body stores certain toxins in fat.
Yes.
And so over your lifetime, you end up accumulating a lot of toxins, which is one of the reasons you're not supposed to quickly lose weight, because it can release those into your bloodstream very quickly. But that when you die, you also have a bunch of toxins in your body. Do you have any detail on that?
Yeah, so we sometimes get questions, you know, what if I've had chemotherapy or something? am I still a candidate for this? Yes, I mean, soil is great at filtering, and to be honest, walking around, the person alive releases more toxins than the deceased person does. At that point, you're more in danger when you are walking around, in your everyday life to release toxins. So we haven't seen anything that shows that there's been any problems. A lot of it is concern that it's going to get into the water there, but the soil is so good at that there's been really no concern, unless you were to be buried right next to a stream or something that you were going to flow right in there and you had extensive medical procedures done or something, then maybe there might be something, but realistically, it's not a concern.
Certainly. Well, thanks. Anyone else have any questions before we wrap it up? All right. That'll conclude the talk on green burials. And Chad, but really appreciate you spending the time reviewing this with us. This has been extremely informative. And if anybody wants to give a round of applause, not sure how.
Thank you.
But
Thank you. I thank you very kindly for having me.